We're making a movie of where the Tory party is now. What would you call it? Or a drama? How would you describe it?
Incredulity. They're incredulous.
Dominic Grieve, who used to be a Conservative MP, and indeed he was Attorney General in David Cameron's government. He got pushed out of the Conservative Party by Boris Johnson because he stood firmly against proroguing Parliament and the shenanigans on Brexit. Dominic Grieve is always a man of absolute common sense, but also a man who respects and abides by the rule of law. And he discussed how bonkers the position is right now in the Conservative Party, particularly because of Robert Jenrick's position on wanting or saying that he is prepared to leave the ECHR and trying to build public opinion to support such a catastrophic act is frightening.
At least one of those two candidates is about to take the party in a very bad direction indeed.
And which one is that?
Well, that's Jenrick.
Both the candidate and the direction?
Yes, for very clear reasons, because the Conservative Party is in opposition. It's not going to go back into government for almost 4.5 years, might be slightly shorter than that. This is a time for thinking. What is it that the country needs? How can one craft sensible policies that can deliver that? And when you listen to Robert Jenrick, he's not talking about that at all. This is just a little bit of populist tub thumping, suggesting that there are easy remedies to the country's problems and appealing specifically to the membership of the party, or trying to, not in fact to the Conservative voting electorate at all. And his stance on the European Convention on Human Rights is just complete garbage. It is quite clear that getting rid of the ECHR, there may be arguments for it, there may be arguments against it, is not going to solve the immigration problem with illegal migration into this country one little bit. It's also clear that if you do get rid of the ECHR, there are significant consequences, which he doesn't really want to discuss or just glosses over. One of which is that it is a breach of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and it's not at all clear how he intends to get round that. He made a suggestion about getting round it with a Northern Ireland Bill of Rights that, frankly, doesn't stack up. And there's also a significant impact on our trade and cooperation agreement with the EU. It doesn't even discuss that. In fact, it's underpinned by our participation in the European Convention on Human Rights, which is subscribed to by every European country except Belarus. So all this is fantasy politics. And if he does win the leadership, then I'm afraid that unless this is a contrick on his part on the Conservative Party membership, then I'm afraid he is going to be taking the party in a direction where it will be completely unelectable and actually irrelevant.
We recently had Boris Johnson discussing his book, which he concedes that his claims that he would do a no-deal Brexit were a bluff. In his book, even Boris Johnson admits that no-deal Brexit would have been a catastrophe. And leaving the ECHR would be very similar to no-deal Brexit. It is, to all intents and purposes, the same thing. We would end up with no trade deal with the EU. Potentially, relations would break down with the USA as well and other trade partners. This would leave us as a pariah state. It would cause untold trouble in Ireland. And it is unthinkable. Of course, the Reform Party are calling for the same thing. The Reform Party, which were UKIP, Nigel Farage told everybody that Brexit would control immigration. And since Brexit, immigration has quadrupled. We have lost control. If people believe that Nigel Farage is going to have our best interests at heart, they really need to think again, because leaving the ECHR would be a catastrophe for Britain.
Now, one of your central promises in your campaign is to take the country out of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a big legal framework. The UK has been part of it for decades. And it's important because when it comes to Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, It's in that text as being something that is absolutely vital. Ian Cork wants to know, can you explain what leaving the ECHR would do in terms of the direct impact on the Good Friday Agreement?
I don't approach this from an ideological perspective.
Really?
I approach it from a practical one.
But there's a specific
what we
issue
need to do
on
is
Northern
ensure
Ireland.
that there isn't a knock-on consequence in Northern Ireland.
So how would you do
The Good
that?
Friday Agreement is not reliant upon the ECHR.
It's a fundamental part of it.
Well, it envisages a Northern Irish Bill of Rights, which would protect the citizens of Northern Ireland domestically according to the ECHR. And that's what I propose. I propose that we have a British Bill of Rights, or indeed a Northern Irish Bill of Rights, which does what the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement suggested and protects the rights of those citizens. I don't think it's impossible for the country of Magna Carta and habeas corpus to find a way to ensure that the rights and liberties of our own citizens, whether in Northern Ireland or anywhere else across our country, are properly protected and respected,
Do you think that,
as they were prior to us joining the ECHR.
Do you think that the nationalist community in Sinn Féin would sit down and think, okay, they're going to accept a British Bill of Rights? I mean, you can say, oh, you just do another piece of legislation. But the Good Friday Agreement explicitly says that the ECHR is part of the legal framework there.
Well, all enduring agreements require a degree of pragmatism, and you see that with the Good Friday Agreement in many different respects. I mean, for example, it speaks of a Northern Irish Bill of Rights, which in fact Tony Blair as Prime Minister chose not to proceed with. He chose to do a Human Rights Act instead. So there are different ways of resolving this issue. What I want to do is ensure the rights of Northern Irish citizens are protected domestically, rather than reliant upon a foreign court in Strasbourg. And I say, I wouldn't do this lightly. I'm doing this because I don't want to have criminals on our streets who we need to get out. I don't want terror suspects on our streets or in our prisons. And those are things that matter to people of all parts of the community in Northern Ireland, as it does to people across the country.
We've talked about that before. I know you're never going to be someone, I think, who sits there and says, I'm going to wholeheartedly back the Conservatives. But if you were making a movie of where the Tory party is now, what would you call it? Or a drama? How would you describe it?
Incredulity. They're incredulous. They are ridiculous. That was ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. I thought, I couldn't understand. I thought, what is this man doing? Who is he? We have an expression in Scotland, which is, his head is full of mince. Do you know what that means?
I know what that means, but explain it to our viewers, because they don't all have the same Scottish lexicon as you and me.
Well, it means that he just doesn't know. I mean, the whole thing about Northern Ireland is just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. Well, when you think of the Good Friday Agreement and the care and what went into that, that's absolutely nonsense. Man, if they get him as leader, they're welcome to it.
And yet lots of our viewers are really worried about what's happening in terms of immigration in this country, and lots of Conservatives
Immigration in this country is a problem. There's no question about it. But you're not going to solve it that way. The problem with immigration is what's been happening in the Middle East, what's happening in the Middle East right now. Can you imagine the amount of immigrants we're going to see even more? Mm-hmm. It's a world problem. It's not just a British problem. It's a world problem. And we don't attend to it properly.
Okay. Or I chose you. Look, alongside Ken Clarke during the referendum campaign, a somewhat younger Robert Jenrick and a younger Kenneth Clarke talking about the referendum. Now, one of our viewers has found that at the time you were signatory to a letter that said leaving the EU would lead us into a dystopia. Julie asks, Robert Jenrick was a signatory to a letter that describes Brexit as dystopia. Do you still agree with any of its contents? And in case you'd forgotten, you said, we prefer the advantages of membership to a go it alone, us against them dystopia.
Well, I don't remember that letter, but my view has changed, absolutely. But I was concerned that it would prove difficult for the British state to realise all the benefits of Brexit. And in some respects, I've been justified in that regard. We've had a great deal of economic and constitutional disruption as a result of leaving the European Union, but I don't think we've gained all of the benefits. And that's what I want to see. And in my jobs as a minister, I've always fought to ensure that we do get the benefits of those, whether it's starting free ports, whether it's as immigration minister, ensuring that we use the levers of legal migration now that we've ended freedom of movement to gain control over our borders.
Do you disagree with your younger self?
Well, I would vote differently. I've said that on many occasions. I would vote differently if I had the opportunity today. I've seen, for example, on immigration, that leaving the European Union has given us something which we have not had before in our history, which is the ability to control our borders and to have a proper philosophy as a country on our immigration system. Now, those decisions were poorly made in the immediate aftermath of the 2019 general election. I'm the first to concede
by the government you were part of.
The ministers at the time made poor decisions. They created an immigration system which was even more liberal than the one we had in the EU. I fought relentlessly to change that, and I did so as a minister. Ultimately, I resigned when I felt that I couldn't do even more. Okay. What I want to do is ensure the next Conservative government actually gets the full benefit of Brexit, which I think are very significant.